What if you could develop skills to help manage IBS symptoms in only 10 minutes per day? This episode is sponsored by Mahana Therapeutics, which offers the Mahana IBS app. This is a new app that offers evidence-based cognitive behavioral therapy to reduce the severity of IBS symptoms. Until the end of June, this is available at no cost for eligible patients. Get started now and download the app at mahanatx.com/The Gut Show.
Welcome back to The Gut Show. I'm your host, Erin Judge, and today's episode is with a personal trainer, Barb, who also lives in Nashville with me. She's a fellow Nashville professional, but I've connected with her the most through social media. And what I love about Barb is that she takes a non-diet approach to personal training and to fitness, which you might think, do these actually go together? What does diet have to do with fitness? But diet culture is deeply influenced by and influences fitness culture. And a lot of trainers really lean into that and prey on that versus encourage movement in a way that is intuitive and feels good and is joyful, which is something that Barb and I talk about in today's episode. So I want you to come into the episode with an open mind to the conversation and to sort of think through like what we talk about and what that really means to you, because the value, I think, of this conversation, something I got out of it personally as we were recording it, was a better understanding of what movement means to me, what exercise means to me, and how to frame even my exercise goals and plans and how I view and approach that in a different way, which is going to be more giving to me and a form of self-care versus a form of punishment or another to-do on the list or whatever it may be. So very excited for you to listen to today's episode. And if there is any thought that comes up, please join us in the Gut community on Facebook and then let us know like what you were thinking, or you can always post on Instagram and post on your stories, tag myself at erinjudge.rd as well as Barb. You'll find all of those links in the show notes, and let us know what you thought, what questions you had, or what you would add to the conversation. So I'm going to be quiet, enjoy the conversation, and let me know what you think at the end.
Hey, Barb, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited for our conversation. And I want to get started with just your story. So how did you become the non-diet dietitian or non-diet trainer, not dietitian, thinking in the wrong way, same thing, right? You're not the dietitian, but why did you become the non-diet trainer?
I got to stay in my scope of practice here. Yeah, I am definitely the non-diet trainer. I always like to say I'm not the only one, which is a blessing. That means that there's other non-diet trainers, but that is the name that I settled on. I'll kind of scoot back maybe a few years, but also a little bit of background. I like to clarify that a lot of people get into becoming a trainer because they have maybe some experience with like sports and athletics, and they like really fell in love with that. That is not my story. I was just like a kid that generally was kind of active, but like wasn't really. You would probably find me in high school, like writing poetry and being like an indie artsy kid. I didn't really do a whole lot of team sports. I think I did rec gymnastics. I was a horse girl at some point. All very, very casual and non-competitive involvements in sports and like movement in general. My family was not super wild about movement, but we did a lot of stuff together. So I remember like on Sundays, instead of doing the whole church thing, we would probably just go to like a trail and go hike. So we called it Dirt Church. And it was really nice. So we like spent quality time together that way. So that's kind of like my childhood background on movement. And there was never like a time that I had a significantly negative relationship with movement, which I do want to clarify because I think a lot of us do. I feel like I was kind of stuck in like neutral to positive territory for the most part. And now looking back at it with all that I know, I do think that part of what contributed to that was like my privilege of like being able-bodied, being thin, being white, being cisgendered. Like I had access to a lot of those spaces and didn't really have a whole lot of like negative or traumatic experiences. So then I think probably around maybe high school, going into college, that little transitory period, I happened to develop something that I would now recognize as orthorexia. So I, didn't know it at the time. I thought I was just like hella committed to health and wellness and, really educating myself and whatever. And around the same time, I also started dancing. I kind of danced throughout high school, again, non-competitively, nothing too serious. But it was interesting to see my relationship with food and movement kind of going slightly opposite directions. I'm not saying my relationship with movement was like perfect and always hunky-dory. There was a lot of unlearning to do around my movement practice as well. But for the most part, movement was there for me as like a mental health tool. Not to replace therapy, but as a therapeutic process where I noticed there was like a specific memory in high school where I was like, coming back from school, I just like was really anxious and nervous and I didn't feel like I did well on a test that I had that day. And so I had a stomach ache and it was interesting to see like, okay, anxiety, stomach ache, body is connected to mind. And, at the time I was working in my dance studio. So I was the only one in the studio, was just kind of cleaning up and getting it ready for the afternoon. And I think for maybe 30 to 45 minutes, I just turned on the music and I was just free dancing in the studio. No one else was there. And I realized at the end of the 45 minutes, my stomach ache was gone. My mood was lifted. And I was like, this is wild. It just blew my brains that movement could affect my body and my mind in such a quick and immediate way. And so that kind of started to, I didn't know it at the time, but it definitely started to lay the groundwork for stuff that I would end up doing later. So throughout college, you're figuring out what am I going to do? And so I went through the whole process of, I'm going to be, going to med school, just like a bajillion other people. Both my parents are MDs. So I was like, yes, totally going to go that route, going to go into the research route, et cetera. And I realized as I was going through school and going through this process, I was spending a ton of time, just exploring movement on my own time. So I was going to the gym. I started also taking other women to the gym and being like, hey, so here's how you can kind of get yourself acquainted with weights, the whole weight section, because it was still primarily male dominated and whatever. So it's really cool to see hey, that's that stuff that I think that I'm just doing on the side is really what lights me up. Eventually, as soon as possible, got certified to be an ACE certified group personal or group fitness instructor. And then ended up working at a really, really awesome gym here in Nashville called Get Fit 615. I worked there for 5 years. I want to say almost on the dot to the day. And it was incredible because during that entire time that I was there, I was never, ever encouraged, or it was just never part of our protocol to take weights, to take body measurements, to comment on body changes, whether people got more muscular or bigger or smaller or whatever. It was just we're going to focus on the movement and we're going to focus on how you're feeling during the movement. Not only is that really great information as a trainer in general to unpack, hey, are your knees hurting? Are you feeling it in the muscles that we hopefully want you to feel it in? But also just how are you feeling? Does this scare you? Does this feel enjoyable to you? Do you hate every second of this? And how can we respond to that? So I think that was a really key moment for me to go, okay, this is something that I not only absolutely love, but I also can envision myself doing this as a full-time gig. So even though I started training, I want to say in 2015, so I was still in college at the time, fantastic college job, super fun. Then around, I want to say 2019, 2020, I graduated in 2017. So a little bit later, I was like, okay, we're doing this. And so in 2020, I took a Instagram course with the movement maestro, Shantae Cofield. She's incredible. And I officially changed my little Instagram handle to non-diet trainer. And I was like, oh, this is happening. And I specifically changed it to non-diet trainer because I wanted, I didn't even want to take the anti-diet approach. It was just hey, we're just not, that's not even going to be relevant to our training per se. And I tell clients that I know that sometimes trainers can like kind of have some wiggle room with like nutritional guidelines of like, hey, some general guidelines with food or general meal prep or something like that. And then some trainers definitely take it outside of their scope of practice with assigning meal plans and all that stuff that is definitely not allowed, but they do it anyway. And so I was like, you know what? I want to really own and talk about the movement piece because that's one within my scope of practice and two, my passion. If someone wants to talk about food, cool. I'll always refer them out. And for the most part, I'll kind of refer to food of like sharing recipes or foods we really enjoyed because that's always super fun. I always have found really great recipes from clients and vice versa, restaurants that we've enjoyed, or just making sure that they've eaten enough food beforehand, making sure that they have the nourishment that they need to do the stuff that we're about to engage in. So that's really the only ways that I really talk about food, which is funny to look back on. Maybe it's part of just my story of just like, I've spent years and years thinking too much about food. And at this point, it's like, hey, let's maybe simplify it a little bit, at least on my end, and focus on the movement and the present moment and just like being here instead of feeling like I'm going to be that kind of trainer who's going to be like judging your food and shaming you for your food choices. And it's like, no, I'm not going to micromanage you with that. You're an adult and you get to make choices that feel good for you. Yeah. So that's how I've arrived at being the non-diet trainer. I feel like it's been kind of step by step, very slow process. And now all of a sudden it feels like it's just the right thing.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I didn't know that much of your story. So I came across you from Get Fit Sit Zone 5. I used to go there as well. One of the best gyms in Nashville for sure. Just like fun and energetic. And I think I remember one big takeaway that I'll never forget from going there. And I was already a dietitian at the time and already kind of was moving into a bit, not really, I wouldn't even call myself like anti-diet either. It's just kind of a like weight loss days. Like I don't care to focus on that. It's like it's not fun and engaging and like, you know, uplifting for me. And so I kind of moved away from that even myself. But I remember being there and I forgot what it was. It's Kate Moore, who was the founder, and she was the owner at the time. But she would say something about like the thoughts. Like we had to reframe thoughts or words, right? Of I don't like this. Or I like it's almost like I want this to be over, or like those grunts and that feeling, and just like reframing it into like I get to do like one more set, or what am I actually feeling here, instead of just like, oh, I don't want to do it. It's like, well, what is my actual feeling? Is it that like I am struggling to breathe, or you know, whatever it was. And I remember those like little things were such a game changer for me, and I still use that in practice now in different ways, obviously with nutrition, but it was just such a big thing that was small, but huge. And that kind of goes into my next question. So I know that you mentioned, you know, you decided not to take a non-diet approach, and it seems like diet and fitness, they shouldn't be as interwoven as they are. You're right. A lot of people know their scope of practice, and even those like sayings like abs are made in the kitchen. It's like, I think it brings back this thought of like, well, movement is only there for the purpose of making your body look a certain way. And so why did you decide or feel it was important to really remove the diet component and like kind of transition that outcome focus? And what does that really look like practically? Like what if someone's like, I have no idea what it means to work out or move if I'm not thinking about what I can eat and earn, or how my body looks, or, you know, all of these different problem areas.
Yes. And that's so funny. I don't know if until this moment, I mean, I know that there's that connection between diet and exercise because we're always told like, hey, it's as simple as calories in, calories out. You just have to move more and eat less, blah, 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 blah. And it's always in relation to weight loss. Or if someone's like, well, I feel like now it's changed into, well, I'm not doing weight loss. I'm doing fat loss. I'm doing body composition changes. And it's like, hey, it's still kind of the same. It reminds me of Scooby-Doo, you know, where they like pull the sheet off of the like the ghost or whatever. It's like, hey, it's actually this person. So I feel like that kind of goes hand in hand. And so we're doing these calculations, and that's just not at the end of the day, how I want to view movement and how I want to teach movement and how I want people to learn movement. I always go back to watching like a pet or a child moving their bodies. And it's just, they don't move their bodies in the ways that we as adults move our bodies. Dogs don't like go outside into the yard and like run sprints back and forth for 30 seconds, watch a timer, rest for 30 seconds, and then do it over and over again for, 8 rounds. And then they're going to be like jumping to the fence for 10 reps. And it's like, dogs don't do that. They run around because they want to express joy or stress or frustration, or they get the zoomies, or when they want to lay down into the sun, they just do that. They don't think about how many calories it's burning. And of course, like once they go back inside, they're like, oh my gosh, I'm hungry. I want to eat something. This is great. Like I'm going to have a snack. And that's really like what I want us to bring our movement back to. And maybe that is why I made that executive decision, even for myself, for a bunch of reasons, to not really even kind of talk about the food component. And that's not a, like a nag or anything at trainers that do educate around that, because I think there is lots of like re-education or like myths that we need to educate around, where it's like, hey, like carbs are not the enemy, et cetera, et cetera. Very important science behind that. But I think I wanted to just simplify it and focus just on the movement, because they're always mentioned together in like the same breath. And like you mentioned, it's kind of like that, oh, well, I have to move so that I can, eat this thing, or I ate this thing, so then I have to move. And it's like, oh my gosh, your body is not some like, little equation that we can just kind of like manipulate this, that, and the other. Our bodies, especially for menstruating individuals, changes literally like day to day, week to week. It is not the same, and its needs are not the same from day to day. And it's like kind of impossible to track it to the exact amount. So I, at some point it's like, maybe give up the game and being so exhausted and stressed about trying to do that. Our bodies are a lot smarter than we think they are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something that people miss is, which I find fascinating as kind of a scientist, right? So I went through nutrition and a lot of disordered, things that are throughout that, and studying that. It's not for, it messes with your mind, put it that way. Just learning all of the science, because you do learn the body as like a robot machine when it doesn't really work that way. And that's just kind of how science can become a bit messy and muddy. It doesn't apply to everyone the same way. But it's so fascinating, because when we're looking at exercise, we know it's a good thing, right? It's healthy. Exercise is healthy. Anytime we are looking at research on preventing disease, like exercise and movement, it's part of that. And I think we've pulled it out to mean, well, exercise, because it results in weight loss, is the healthy thing. When if you actually look at research and science, that's not even the thing at all. Like the benefits of movement and exercise, which I know we're going to get into a little bit more, it's like with your heart and with your lung capacity. I mean, looking at COVID now, right? It's like even immune function and the ability to breathe. That has nothing to do with the weight component of it at all. And it's never been shown to be that in research. So if we're thinking about, I'm exercising to earn a donut this morning or whatever it may be, where it's just like such a silly reward, when the actual reward is so much better of like how we're feeling and moving. And I feel like we almost like compromise the real reward for these like trivial like things that aren't satisfying. Because then how satisfying is a donut if you feel like you had to sprint forever to get it?
Yes. I feel like, and I do still see these floating around, and it always like throws me off, because I'm like, why are we still doing this? But, especially around like holiday weekends or whatever, where there's like this equation of like, if you eat X, Y, and Z, then know that that's going to be X amount of burpees. And it's like, wait a dang minute. First of all, we are ignoring, like, I feel like our bodies are like these flesh sacks, or like if they are machines, they're like very ooey gooey machines. Like, yes, there are processes that they do. We can study them, we can observe them, but at the same time, like they're a little like a little muddled. Like we have a general idea of what's happening. And it still can be different from person to person. But I always think about like, Yeah, at the end of the day, even if it is true that, a donut contains X amount of energy, because that's what I think about, like calories, that's a unit of energy. That's literally the definition. And if then I am expending that energy doing movement stuff, like, yes, that may be true. Like, I understand. But at the same time, I love that you pointed to like, well, how is that going to be motivating? Because so many of us I'll have tons of questions of like, how do I get motivated? Like, I'm just not motivated. And I'm like, well, what's your reason right now? Because that reason is clearly not a good enough or interesting enough reason. I like to talk about like chasing the carrot instead of running away from the stick, because I feel like, and people might kind of like have some differing opinions on this, but I'm definitely all for positive reinforcement. I think that our brains work really well when we actually just are like, it's not even like a mind hacking thing. It's just like understanding human nature. We obviously, and like also animal nature in general, we want more of the nice, good things that feel generally pleasant, things that generally bring us joy or some sort of reward or whatever. And I'd rather just focus on that, because I like to use the example of strength training. Strength training does show that, especially in like people with higher estrogen levels, over time, a lot of us are at a higher risk for osteoporosis. And then at the same time, strength training can combat that. Super great, right? So I'm like avoiding the risk of getting osteoporosis if I strength train, like multiple times a week. But I don't do my strength training practice because I'm like, oh yeah, pump and iron, let's go, strong bones. And later on in like 30 years or whatever, I'm going to decrease my risk of osteoporosis. Like, that's not my main motivating factor. It's a nice little tidbit to know that I'm doing that. But at the same time, I'm like, that's not interesting enough for me. Like, no. So a lot of the times I feel like people just need a better reason for themselves that feels like a short-term reward. And I know that those also get kind of like pushed aside as like, that's not a good enough reason. You need like a good long-term reason. And those are cool too, like movement that's sustainable for the rest of your life. And thinking about myself as an 80-year-old, like I would love to go on walks and just like bird watch and stuff. That is my vision. Or like go to aerobics, water aerobics class. I would love that. But at the same time, that doesn't like connect with me right now. That feels really far off. My brain has a hard time comprehending that. And so what I would rather do is, again, like focus on the present moment of like, what is my body feeling right now in this moment? Like, do I feel like, especially in like, when I think about group classes back at Get Fit, it was like, oh, I'm like playing with a dog that was there, Emma. She was incredible. She's like licking sweat off your face. And then you're there with like all of the other people, obviously pre-COVID, but like all of these people that were like high-fiving you and like encouraging you. And you have like all this community around you. The music is awesome. And so I'm like seeing and feeling all these things with all five senses. And it's like, that feels good enough for me. And in the moment, like, I don't have to wait a week, a month, a year, a decade to like feel those effects. I can just feel them right now. They're accessible to me right now. And I understand that that's not something that we're taught to prioritize in our movement practice. It's always like, especially with weight loss, like intentional weight loss, regardless if it's, we can talk about the, 95% failure rate. Even if you're like, well, I'm the part of the 5% that was successful, it's still like a long-term process. It's a lot of mind management and this and that. And it's like, I don't know. To me, I would much rather focus on like what is happening right now. Like a lot of my clients within that first month are like, I already feel pretty strong. Like I already feel like my moods boosted. I always feel like I am like prioritizing my own self-care right now with this practice. I already feel like, I'm getting out of the house and getting more energy. And that's super awesome. I would rather that they feel that as soon as possible instead of like, well, we got to get at this for another 6 months and then you'll see results. I'm doing air quotes for all the folks listening, but I am so here.
All of that like, it doesn't feel good. I feel like it just takes away the what you mentioned, like the exciting rewards of like, I increased my weight, or I'm, running. For me, it's running. Running's always my biggest measure with movement, because to me, it's really challenging, but also I love running when it's rewarding, whenever I can do it. And so like training for that, it's like that first run where it's like, I felt so good, or like I ran like faster up the hill, it's like that feels so exciting versus like, oh no, like I'm getting to stand on a scale, and I've been through that. I did that in college. Like I, went through all of that as well. And like, and I did come from sports too, where it was like, we had a sport goal. So it was like, can I hit the ball more? Can I throw the ball better? Can I run between the bases faster? And that was so much more rewarding. So I was working towards something big alongside people that I cared about. And then moving into college, where it was all about like weight and how I looked and impressing people. And, that just did not go well. So that is interesting. And so that kind of goes into one of the core things that you teach through social media. So follow you for 2 days, and you'll see the words joyful movement. It's a big part of your work and your practice. What does joyful movement actually mean in relation to even some of the things that you've already talked about? And why is this such an important practice or kind of verbiage that you use for your work?
So there's no official definition. Super fun. I almost want to just keep it that way. I also want to say that I'm not the only one that came up with it, or the first one that came up with it. The first time I was kind of introduced to the idea of joyful movement as like an official thing was probably through intuitive eating. So that's where it came up for me. And I was like, oh, this is something that I'm aware of, or I practice in different ways. Particularly for me, it was dance, but joyful movement can look like a lot of different things. I think there's a lot of misconceptions around what it is. And so for me, my definition of joyful movement is like a radical approach to movement that prioritizes your pleasure, your enjoyment, and the present moment. That's what it ultimately ends up for me. There's also like these elements of compassion, flexibility, interoceptive awareness. So being aware and, what your body is telling you of like, hey, like my heart rate is high and this feels okay. Or, hey, my heart rate is high and it really doesn't feel safe and okay. I can slow down. I can take a rest. Rest is a really big part of joyful movement, even though in the word, it's like movement, of course, but rest is included in that. So that's kind of my definition. And I want to say a big reason why I do focus so much on it as a trainer is because I think there's a severe lack of it. There's plenty of accounts, plenty of things that like tap into this idea of like hard work and hustling and grinding. And that's probably something that we're familiar with, especially from like the athletics world, because, hey, you're trying to, as an athlete, you're trying to like perform and perfect this art or this skill of your sport. Like that totally makes sense. We see it in the Olympics. But that doesn't really make sense to apply to somebody who's just trying to move for like their general health, aka like well-being, mental health, connection, community. Those things will not necessarily apply. Maybe for someone who like derives meaning and motivation and joy from competition, 100% joyful movement could be training for a competition, training for a race, having that end goal or that larger purpose. And so I see that with some of my clients who are like, oh, I want to like do this. I want to push myself out of my comfort zone. And that's cool. And then for some of us, competition is like really intimidating, or it doesn't really provide that, drive or push or whatever you want to call it, because it's like, well, now it's just introducing more and more of that, like comparing myself to others, comparing myself to my past self of like, I used to be able to do this and now I can't. And so then that kind of strips away the joy again out of it. So joyful movement, again, kind of strips it back to that innate feeling, like I've described with like children or like, pets. I even feel like plants kind of do it on their own way. I was watching some stuff about fungi, all mushrooms and stuff. And I was like, oh, they move too in their own like unique ways. It's really cool. But there's a lot less like thinking and planning done with that kind of movement. And there's a lot more presence and a lot more freedom associated with that kind of movement. That doesn't mean that joyful movement has to be the only movement that you do. It doesn't mean joyful movement is like only gentle stuff of like, you can only like gently sway or like do yoga or take walks. That can totally be part of it. But for a lot of us, it can also mean like doing really hard lifting or doing a hard sprint up a hill where you can really feel alive and feel your lungs and heart beating, or feel your strength or your power. Some people really love like stuff like jujitsu or like boxing or something. And so we all have our zones of joy, just like we might have different preferences around like movies that we like or music that we like. There's nothing wrong with someone who likes a horror movie and someone who likes a comedy. Like they're both equally art and equally interesting, but just different people and different personalities. So joyful movement's going to look different in practice for everyone, but ultimately we're putting your enjoyment and your pleasure at the forefront.
Today's episode is sponsored by Mahana Therapeutics. Did you know that cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is an evidence-based option for IBS management? A clinical trial showed that nearly 2 out of 3 patients treated with Mahana IBS reported an improvement in IBS symptom severity. The best part is that this is an easy-to-use app you can do in just 10 minutes per day from the comfort of your phone. Mahana IBS gives you the tools to self-manage symptoms and develop the strategies to live a fuller life with IBS. And until the end of June, Mahana IBS is available at no cost for eligible patients. Get started now and download the app at mahanatx.com/The Gut Show. You can also find this link in show notes. Let's get back to today's episode.
And what would that look like then as a trainer? Because you mentioned, it's not always planned. Maybe there's some intentionality to like certain types of movement that you incorporate, but what does that look like for like your clients? Like, how do you actually incorporate that into the planning part of it?
Yeah, that's been the most interesting part because at the end of the day, my movement teaching kind of centers around strength training. I love teaching people the basics of moving their body through space and building that strength and that like stability kind of feeling. And not only to mention like all of the research that shows that strength training, like twice a week, full body, et cetera, it's like super helpful for us. But what we can do is then sprinkle in that like tuning inwards throughout the whole session. So not only do I check in with them before, like, how's your body feeling? What does your body feel like it needs today? And sometimes people aren't super sure in the beginning. So we'll kind of have a plan as we go through. We'll have our sets, we'll have our warm up, we'll have our sets, we'll kind of rest in between and talk about how things felt, if there needs to be any adjustment, like, hey, maybe 12 reps felt like too much, or maybe this weight felt like too much, or maybe it felt like too little. Maybe someone sometimes undersells themselves and feels like, hey, this actually felt like maybe a 2 out of 10 on the difficulty scale. And I'd be like, hey, in that case, if we want it to feel like a 6 or a 7 out of 10, do you feel comfortable like moving up in weight, seeing what that feels like? So we'll play around with that. There's clearly a lot of questions being asked. There's a lot of curiosity instead of a lot of like prescriptive stuff of like, hey, now we're going to hit it hard and do this, that, and the other. Because as I'm training someone or working with someone, that I always keep in mind is like, I don't know what that person's body feels like in that moment. I don't have that cool, like, telepathy going on with my clients. I wish I did. But I have to ask questions. And then sometimes they even notice that they haven't been paying attention to how their body feels during that movement. So being able to kind of rewind and say like, you know what, I wasn't really sure how I was breathing during that movement. Let me check in again. Or maybe was I not breathing? Was I holding my breath the whole time? So there's a lot of questions being asked. And there are totally sessions where I have a plan kind of in place, in mind. And a client will come in and say like, hey, my low back hurts really bad. So can we do something that's going to either help with that? Or maybe they're like, I'm really stressed out, or I slept like crap last night, or any number of things. We're just like, I'm not feeling super good. I will give them the option to just like have a time where we can just slow down, do some breathing. I've totally taken a walk with someone before just to like get outside, get some sunshine, not have to think a whole bunch about, coordinating our limbs together in space. And that's always allowed. So it's really interesting to see how sessions develop. Some people will kind of just like kind of follow the plan with little tweaks. And some people will need that adjustment so that you can start to trust your body in the present moment, because that's the kind of funny and weird part about, working with a trainer is like, you don't know when you're planning that session or putting that in your calendar and saying, hey, at Tuesday at 3 p.m., I'm going to have this session, but you have no idea how you're going to feel actually once Tuesday at 3 p.m. rolls around. So that's why we create that flexibility so that you have the opportunity to practice some like all or something thinking instead of all or nothing thinking, where it's like, either I'm going to hit it hard in this session or I'm just not going to go. You can show up and see what might work for you that day.
That's awesome. And definitely radical, right? Because it's like not what we typically see, especially in places where you have a trainer present. I think a lot of people sign up for training for accountability, that word, or like, oh, I'm going to this to get this specific exercise in versus, checking in with what I need, how I feel, which that's more sustainable, right? And so you're teaching skills that are sustainable, that if you are hiking at 80 years old, how do you like check in and adjust? Which is, I see that. I'm a long-term thinker. So I always see myself, okay, I'm hiking that mountain at 8, whenever I'm retired. And that motivates me, but that's funny because we're all so different. And I get there by doing the sprints and things like, okay, if I can do this now, I'm going to get there whenever I'm 80. But what you mentioned with trust, like that is a big part of what we see with this whole gut community. So I work with IBS, digestive disorders, since a lot of people listen to this specific podcast, but movement is tense and can be even more just kind of mind warped than we even see within like the diet culture world. And a big part of it is that we do know like high intensity exercise can trigger symptoms. It's shown, right? Stress response. And so the amount of intensity is different for each person, but it can happen. And so with people who are experiencing IBS specifically, there's going to be like poor trust in movement because they may know that, or maybe they've experienced that and have had like a not so great experience where they've had more of a stomach ache after moving their bodies, or went to an exercise class and, had an accident, like that's happened, or they've had to run out, or, all of these experiences have happened. And so a lot of times people who are dealing with digestive issues, they do just avoid it altogether on the spectrum. Do you see this in your work at all? Like even in maybe other medical conditions or with like fatigue or, whatever it may be. And if so, like what would you really encourage people to do, or what have you found has worked, or kind of reclaiming that trust?
Yeah, 100%. See folks with all kinds of other stuff going on. And I think that's when like, I don't know, like listening to your body sounds like the easiest thing or like the most vague thing. It's like, how do I do that? I always describe listening to your body sometimes as being a practice of like, if you have that one like random manual watch that you like left somewhere like 10 years ago in the back of a closet in an old backpack, and it's like beeping because it has that alarm at 9 o'clock for some reason still. And you're like, where is that beeping coming from? And then the process of listening to your body is like that process of trying to find where that sound is coming from and like, what is going on? And so many of us just want to kind of like plug our ears and just be like, nope, this is what I've been taught. It's just like, ignore whatever that beeping is. And I'm just going to push through. And I think a lot of, traditional fitness still encourages us to do that, which is a huge disservice. I can imagine for folks with IBS, also PCOS, like so many other conditions. And so we leave out a lot of like chronically ill, marginalized folks, disabled folks, like it's pretty ridiculous. And so when your standard is just like someone who has like no problems at all, is like totally able-bodied and neurotypical and blah, 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 like you should be able to function just like anyone else, quote unquote, should function. And it's like, you're not leaving room for kind of the reality of the human experience of just like, oh, shoot, I need to like run to the bathroom, or, oh, shoot, I need to modify this, or, oh, shoot, this doesn't work for my body. And something that I've seen come up time and time again is people with the experience that they've been, let's say in like a group fitness class of some sort, and the instructor made them feel bad intentionally or unintentionally, doesn't matter, but made them feel bad or ashamed or guilty for their body doing what it does. And made them feel like taking the modification is the weak thing, or lowering the intensity is the lazy thing, or is the cop out, or is the, you're kind of like sandbagging it. There's so many terms that come up when I'm just like, but that's exactly how you start to listen to your body, is to, again, follow that beeping noise somewhere in the back and learn to trust that that's the right decision, instead of just plugging your ears and saying, well, I should just push through anyway because my body is wrong or it's not functioning as it should be. So screw it. I'm just going to like follow whatever this instructor is telling me because I'm going to let them down otherwise. And I just think we're doing such a disservice when we teach things like modifications being like, oh, well, if you have to, then I guess you can take the jump out of this. And it's like, wait a second. Like, I think about probably one of the most hated things. Well, number one being running, number two, probably burpees. I'm sure there is many other ones, but they tend to be kind of on the higher side, where it's like, yeah, like I do not like those. And I think it's because we haven't been taught that like a slower run is okay, or like a run walk still counts, or that like a burpee without the jump, or inclining our hands instead of having to go all the way to the floor. All of those still count. They're still going to probably get our heart rate up in some way, or still going to work and move our body in some way. And it's also the instructor's job to be able to quickly figure out what's still going to get kind of quote unquote the desired effect, or be something that's somewhat similar, but that's going to work for your body better. I describe it kind of like when we start to teach folks, or when we start to learn that, hey, maybe clothes should fit our body and not our bodies fit our clothes. Like maybe we should just find the size that's appropriate for us, or the fit that's appropriate for us, and that feels good. And exercise is the same way. Like I just need to find the exercise or the version of the movement that feels good for me in my body, that's right here, right now, instead of trying to like, I don't know, work my body into something that it is not like in this moment. Like, yeah, my body right now is probably not going to do like, I don't know, a pistol squat or something. It's like, no, it's probably not going to be there. If though, the cool thing about movement is it is a skill. And if at some point we want to work towards something, there's probably a very slow and progressive way to get there. But also if the desire is not there, I'll have clients who are like, I never cared to do a pull-up. I'm like totally cool with never doing one. I'm like, cool, then we're not going to necessarily work towards it. I'll still work on grip strength. I'll still work on pulling movements because it's great for our shoulder health, et cetera, et cetera. But like, we don't have to worry about working towards a goal that we don't care about. I'm not going to try to like magician this like desire out of you, because it's not necessary either. So I feel like when we expand on our definition of what movement can really be for us and how it can serve us, instead of like punish us or truly like not make us feel good at the end of the day, and knowing that, if it makes us feel worse, that doesn't mean that the movement is better. Like if we sweat more, have a higher heart rate, or almost pass out and puke, or whatever, like, or yeah, any number of things, then that doesn't mean that it was better. Or same with soreness, like just because it makes us really sore afterwards doesn't make that movement better. And there's like actual research for that. Soreness is just a measure of like, hey, your muscles were not used to doing this thing, and then you suddenly did this thing, and now your muscles have not adapted to it just yet. And that's all that means. I consider myself fairly active. I do strength training multiple times a week, but if I did something like horseback riding, my inner thighs will be smoked because I just haven't practiced that. And that's not because I'm not strong. It just means I'm doing something totally new. So it makes sense that the same thing is going to happen with other bodies too.
Absolutely. And that autonomy, I think, is something that you don't learn, especially in group fitness. I think there's so many positives to group fitness because of community, because of, it's fun, and like there's usually a pattern or a flow or something exciting going on. Like, I taught group fitness for a while too, and it was just fun. But the autonomy can easily get lost if it's not if there's no space made for it. And so I think a lot of people do feel embarrassed to step out or to take a breath or, stop or whatever it may be, when it's like, it's your body, like you have autonomy, to do whatever you need to do. But then knowing what to do is hard. What would you say, those who do have fear of movement, whether that be, I don't know how my body's going to feel, or maybe someone who hasn't been moving for a long time and they're like, I had an injury once, or for me, I fell on a box jump once and it scarred me for life. So anytime I do a box, it's like, I don't know. I don't really know how to do it. What types of strategies do you typically use? Like you kind of mentioned progressive movement or progressive steps. Like what would you use for someone who does have fear, but they're like wanting to explore or learn how things might feel in their body?
Yeah, so I really do recommend either hiring a trainer or finding other resources, because those can be really invaluable. And I'm, saying that with kind of a wink in my eye of like, yeah, not everyone's going to be able to have hiring a personal trainer like accessible in their budget. And so I want to be very clear that there still are ways to kind of still get some feedback or some just ideas and resources to make sure like, hey, if you have questions around like, how do I hold a kettlebell, or how do I like squat if my low back is hurting, or if my knees are caving in, like what can I kind of do here? And that's the beauty of Instagram. Sometimes, as much as I like, there's pros and cons to it always, it can be a wonderful free resource. Same with YouTube, and all that jazz. So I always recommend kind of working with someone that can guide you. And I always say that with a bit of a caveat of like, trainers like myself will have a general understanding of how bodies work, but there will still be individualized things where how your body works, and you need to kind of meet in the middle of like what works for you and what they know about bodies in general, and how can you meet in the middle about that. So it can be helpful to have that kind of like back and forth and that mutual conversation and discussion around like, this feels good, this doesn't feel good, let's try this. And so you can also do that with yourself. I definitely did that with myself for many years of just like videoing myself and like giving myself feedback or seeing like, oh, this is interesting. Why does my body feel like this when I do that? Another thing that I would say can be helpful if there is fear around movement is truly starting small, and also having like a journal so that you can kind of just gently track. I know track can sound like really icky. I know it does for me, but track or just consider it like data gathering or reflection, because our brains will do this really fun thing where it only remembers the bad stuff, where it's like, oh, remember that time that I jacked up my ankle doing this, that, and the other, or, remember how that was just so awful going to that group fitness class. And do remember those, because that's information too, of just like, oh, remember when I went to that place and that trainer was like a real shithead to me. It does happen. And so then you can use that information to be like, hey, maybe let's not go into that kind of studio again. Let's kind of make sure that they align with my values, that they're inclusive, that they're welcoming, that they're adjustable. They treat their members with like compassion and respect. That's important to me. So like use that information, but also use information of like, hey, when I took this 10-minute walk outside and it was beautiful outside and I had my podcast in, or I was with my dog or with a buddy, all of these little details. And then like, oh, I felt good after that situation, or like my stomach felt okay, then use that information so that you can repeat it in the future. So you don't have to like rack your brain and use all these brain cells at the end of the day or at 6 a.m. or whenever you're trying to move to suddenly come up with like a novel idea. It's totally okay to just repeat things that have felt good in the past. And then also leave some room for exploration too. I think this is my favorite part, when you do have the capacity to kind of like nudge outside of your comfort zone to try something different and like expand your definition of what movement can be. So I think about like laser tag. I think about like ice skating. I think about all sorts of like random stuff that we don't always think about when we think about like exercise. I feel like we've kind of narrowed our scope down to like running, yoga, CrossFit, that's it, and nothing else. So really kind of getting curious. I even saw on a list, it was like geocaching and stuff like that. I was like, Cool. I would have never thought of that, but here we are. So using that extra time and when you want to like add some flavor to it, to take some time to explore. And that could truly be like combining like an adventurous like exploration of your city or your neighborhood and like adding movement into the mix of it. So that movement isn't technically like the main thing, but it's kind of like a, I don't know, like a side dish of the whole experience where it's like, oh, we're going to do like a crawl and we're going to get appetizers here and like a main meal here or whatever. That could be cool. So sometimes I am doing movement now, instead of just being like, movements can be incorporated in some way, in a way that feels fun and interesting to me. So hiring someone or getting some resources, staying in your comfort zone and kind of like also journaling what feels good and also what feels bad. If you feel compelled to kind of be like, hey, maybe let's not repeat that because that feels like that had an opposite effect on me. And then exploring things that do feel good or feel novel and interesting because we want to chase after the carrot instead of escaping the stick. That is the better way, in my opinion, to do it.
Yeah, those are great tips. And I think that kind of challenges that thought of like, it's not worth it, right? It's only 10 minutes. It's not worth it when, like you mentioned at the beginning, like our bodies were meant to just be in motion and move. And like, we're meant to be able to like walk from one place to another and enjoy ourselves or, you know, go through the city and explore something new or whatever it may be. Like our bodies are meant to do that. They're not meant to do a 30-minute CrossFit workout. Like we don't have to do that. It's like and then you can build up, you know, strength to do those things in a better way, which I know you've done. I've seen your client that you shared on Instagram of hula hooping, right? Of like building up the skills to hula hoop or those fun things that people can do. And it's like, we sometimes forget that movement doesn't have to be like, oh, I do, you know, 3 sets and 10 reps of all, like whatever it may be of all of these different things. It could be, oh no, I'm developing these muscle groups to be able to do this activity that I really want to do and have fun with, like laser tag or whatever. A lot of our clients love Just Dance, and that's their exercise. And even those like virtual reality things, like that would be a fun way to like move body parts and also not feel like, okay, I like lifting weights too, but it's like not everyone enjoys that. And so it's like finding other things is always really fun. And even yoga, it's like we, recommend that, not traditional yoga. I always like to preface that of like, not like traditional yoga, but those types of flows and stretches and alignment-based exercise. Like that's so great for IBS. Some people don't do it. It's like, there's some fun ways of doing it where you can incorporate like different types of music or flow types or jokes. Different trainers have different things that they incorporate. And it's always fun to explore that too. You never know like what you might enjoy over what, other people will. And like you can still reach the goal by doing it in your own way. I'm that way with running. I love to run. I say that a lot, but I like doing it my own way. I don't want to go, do it someone else's way because it's not as fun as my own.
Exactly.
Kind of on the lines of like tracking. One big piece, this is my last major question for you, is like relationship to body with movement. You mentioned that like you didn't have, a negative relationship with exercise necessarily in your own background, but I know that we see this a lot with even IBS and health, anything revolving awareness, is that sometimes awareness can also open up the door for awareness of things you may not really want to be aware of, right? If you're starting to exercise, there is an increase of like connection to your body. And for some people, especially those with digestive issues, but I've seen it with, body image, body dysmorphia, whatever it may be. I'm sure probably it may be like those who are disabled, like you start to notice maybe your limitations, you notice insecurities, you notice like if you have a mirror present, right? If like I'm looking at my alignment, but I'm also noticing this thing that maybe I don't love to see right now. What have you noticed with that? And how has movement, and what are some like ways, if you know of any, where you can kind of utilize movement to almost improve the relationship to the body and kind of navigate those thoughts that could come along the way?
Yeah, that's a really great point, because I feel like a lot of times when we start to make that shift from how to, movement to, how does my body look, to movement for how does my body feel, sometimes the like phrase of like, oh, look at what your body can do is not actually super empowering for people. This was introduced to me, like my brain exploded by a like disabled advocate. And I was like, oh, that's like super fucking smart. And I didn't think of it that way, because that's how I thought of movement. I was just like, oh, this is so cool. I feel like when I can tune inwards to like what my body can do right now, that feels really empowering for me. But when our bodies can't do the thing, or again, like can't do what they used to do, or not in the same way, or it feels harder, it can start to feel really like disempowering pretty quickly. It's very easy for that shame spiral to set in. And so I think about, especially with clients that, again, I encourage them to like have the choice to say like, hey, do you want to do that challenging thing that's like outside of your comfort zone? Or do you want to do something that you feel like more confident in, or at least it feels tolerable to you to kind of do this movement instead? And that doesn't mean that like every single time it's, from a training perspective, it's going to be like perfect and well-rounded and this and that. But some days we just need to do stuff that makes us not feel worse, instead of just like, oh, this is, challenging and you're not great at it, but like, let's just do a whole bunch of those movements. I think on days when we're more tired, like balancing movements might be extra challenging. And so it's like, yeah, maybe my body can't do that right now, and that's not going to feel super great. Or like, I'm aware of like bloating as I'm kind of like bopping around or walking or something. It's like, how can I be gentle to this body? And how can I use movement to like support myself in this moment? I even think of like allergies. Like I'll have like my sinus stuff is happening and I'm like, my body feels like crap. Like I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Like it doesn't feel great. And so I think about like, how can I use movement or things that are not movement to support my body right now? Like, how can I care for her in a way that feels good, instead of trying to force like a round peg into a square hole kind of thing, where it's just like, this may not be the thing that I need to be doing right now. And I feel like sometimes we forget that that's an option. Just like, yeah, maybe we don't need to do anything at all, or we need to do like a smidge, like a movement snack where we literally just do something for like a minute or two. And then like, that is it. That counts. That's the cap. And we can move on with our lives. We don't have to kind of finagle our ways into like, how do I convince myself into doing this 30-minute workout that I had planned or on my planner. Maybe sometimes we just need to be flexible with that. I wonder if that answers your question a little bit.
No, definitely. It's like that open communication. We kind of talk about that in our practice a lot, of like communication with your body, and not necessarily labeling it as good or bad communication, but using those thoughts of like, okay, what could that mean? Like if I, have that dysmorphia, or I feel a certain way, or even have like a quote unquote negative thought about myself that may be true or self-serving or kind, but like, how can I still be honest with myself and have that thought and like explore that thought? And with movement, I think sometimes we forget that that's an option too, because the autonomy was taken away. And that is a good point, because I don't think about that as often too, as like a very able-bodied person. It's like, what can I do? I do want to be hiking when I'm 80, where someone, may not be able to say that. And like their thoughts may be different. And, I see it sometimes with my clients, like they just want to get out of bed. And it's like,
yes,
okay, you're not training for a marathon, right? You're just trying to survive and like live and, get up and move forward and whatever it may be. So it's like, that's not your goal right now. And, having those thoughts are really important. And then if you are having them, communicating them to your trainer or working with someone who asks those questions. And that being said, if anyone is listening and they're like, oh, I connect to what you're saying, I want to start moving, and like that feels safe for me, and that feels like that would connect with me, how could they work with you, and what would that look like?
So there are currently one of two ways to work with me. One is one-on-one training. I do virtual and in person. The waitlist is currently kind of long. That's on me, but also people are awesome. So I would recommend signing up for that if that is something you're really interested in. And if for some reason you're like, I want to get in earlier, my Instagram also has a bunch of other trainers that I generally refer to who are, again, also weight neutral and non-diet that I would trust for that kind of thing, as well as some gyms. There's a handful of gyms that I would trust with this kind of approach. And then the other one is the Joyful Movement program that I developed back in 2020. It's going to run round number 9 in mid-May. Starting in mid-May, we'll start our first call then in 2022. So I'm really excited for that. It's kind of like a seasonal thing that I run. So I feel like it's really nice to have a different round for each season so we can kind of experience it in different times of the year. And especially I feel like as summer approaches, I already feel my skin crawling with all the diet stuff. So I'm really excited for the summer one for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exciting. So if you guys are looking for that kind of support, we'll link all of that in show notes for you so you can check it out. And you can also always follow Barb on social media, which is a fun way, I think, to even start changing thoughts and like challenging maybe some thoughts before. And like you mentioned, it's not a bad thing for you to move how you want to move, but I think we all benefit from challenging some of the thoughts that we have, because you might be in that athlete mindset, you might do CrossFit and compete in the competitions, and that's not bad, but it's also good to challenge, like, what is the purpose of this for me? Or like, what does this look like? Or what do other people think? And what am I projecting on people? It's something I think I learned from your social media too, is like, am I projecting my view of what this should look like? Even on my clients, where there is prescription almost of like, okay, this movement has been shown to help with this, or these stretches can help with the gas, release or whatever. And it's like, oh wait, maybe I should rethink how I even say that, because like, how do I put it back into their hands to be able to choose how they do that or incorporate that, or, make it more fun for them or whatever it may be. It's like always good to challenge that.
Yeah.
Any last thing you want to share before we go?
Nothing other than just move with more joy and less rules. Speaking of prescriptive things, I was just thinking before I went on to talk with you about how it's so easy as a trainer and as an Enneagram 1, perhaps, to be somebody who just wants to swoop in and check all the things and fix all the things and tell you like, oh my gosh, you're struggling with this, let's fix it this way. And knowing that what makes you feel good, it might take some practice, but you get to figure out what kind of guidelines you want to put in place instead of rules that even I tell folks to kind of like consider. Because I feel like when we replace one rule with another rule, we're back in the same space.
Good thought to share, good wisdom that we can all work on together. Well, thank you so much, Barb. Really enjoyed our conversation. I appreciate you giving your time.
Thanks for having me.